Hi, everybody. We're continuing our series on Josephus. And as you know, Josephus is often singled out as the earliest evidence for a canon. And many people believe that he gives a 22 book canon. We call this the canonical interpretation in his work Against Apion. And throughout this series, we've shown how Josephus has been framed so that people have this expectation that he's giving a canon. In last episode, we looked at the context right before he starts enumerating these books. And this is going to be very important. So if you haven't watched the last episode, I highly recommend that you do, because this will give you even better context for what we're talking about today. Because today we're going to focus on one of a few key elements for the canonical interpretation. They all rest on these elements. And the first element that we're going to address in this episode is his use of the word faith. So when he says the 22 books alone are rightly believed or justly believed or rightly trusted, does he mean that our sense of faith is to be given to only the 22 books, like the canonical interpretation says, or does he use it in a different sense? So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha apocalypse begins right now. Okay, so one of the key elements, there's probably two or three key elements that this canonical interpretation of Josephus rests upon. One of the first ones that we're addressing now is the use of the word faith in the context of the enumeration of the 22 books. The word in Greek, by the way, for faith is pistuo. We're also going to look at apistuo, disbelief or distrust. Okay. And as you know, the word faith can be used in two senses. And this is true both in English and in Greek. It's a very important key theological term. So if the word faith or belief is directed towards a divine object, namely God or scripture, then we would translate it as believe in or have faith in God, or believe in or have faith in the scriptures which are divinely revealed. So, this first meaning of faith, as you can see, is what the canonical interpretation would understand this word to be. And there's another meaning for faith, which means just simply having confidence either in someone or in something. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has divine authority. To understand how Josephus uses this in Against Apion 138, we're going to look at the whole work. We're going to go through every time he uses the Greek term pistuo or apistuo, and we're going to see how he uses this term. Does he use it for divine authority, that we give the assent of faith to a particular document or documents, or does he use it for simply confidence? And I think this survey of how he uses it in book one will be very illuminating. So let's begin our survey, shall we? Okay, so at the very beginning of Against Apion, book one, in section 4, he says, quote, I will employ as witnesses for my statements those judged by the Greeks to be most trustworthy on ancient history as a whole, unquote. Now, if you've watched the previous episode, you know what he's talking about. He's going to lay the case down for his work, Antiquities of the Jews. The Antiquities of the Jews, he traces Jewish history from the creation of the world all the way to roughly his own time. And the Greeks had pushed back on this, and they said, no, Jewish culture is actually a pretty recent development. Why? Because our earliest Greek historians don't mention the Jewish race till relatively late. So they discount the historical claims that he makes in Antiquities because they don't believe that those are reputable historical records. So Josephus wants to vindicate it. So what he does here in this passage is he says that I'm going to show and use for my case those cultures that are deemed most trustworthy by the Greeks. In other words, I'm going to take, you Greeks don't think that my ancient Jewish history is reliable, that's a fabrication or whatever. You know what? Let's look at those cultures that you believe are most trustworthy in recording history, namely the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Phoenicians, and then later, of course, he'll bring in the Jewish histories, which he does in 38. That's what he's talking about in this context. So those cultures, the Egyptian, the Phoenician, the Babylonian, so on, those are deemed most trustworthy. So Josephus frames his vindication of antiquities and its sources by appealing to those cultures that his adversaries consider most trustworthy. And in this context, most trustworthy concerns the quality or the credibility of these cultures' production of history. There's, as you can see, there's no notion here of inspiration. There's no notion of divine authority. And indeed, he's Jewish, right? He doesn't believe the Egyptian histories are inspired by God or Phoenician writings or Babylonians. No, he doesn't believe that. And probably the Greeks don't either. So as you can see here, our first instance, pistuo, simply means credibility, specifically credibility in terms of recording history. The next instance we find of pistuo being used in Against Apion is in section 14, where he says, quote, they have difficulty believing that these philosophical works were all written by those men, unquote. Now, this section in 14, he's trying to trace back what are the earliest records of the Greeks. And some of the earliest records are philosophical writings, you know, the great Greek philosophers from deep in antiquity. And in this particular verse, he notes that even the Greeks themselves don't believe that these philosophical works were actually written by the philosophers they're attributed to. And as you can see, they have difficulty believing, and there's pistuo, that these philosophical works were written by these men. So believing here concerns whether the Greeks find the attributions of various philosophical works credible. Once again, there's no notion of an assent of faith. There's no notion of believing that they have God as their object or anything like that. Obviously, that wouldn't be so for philosophical works. Okay, now we're looking at the use of the word pistuo after he enumerates the 22 books. And the next instance comes at fairly late afterwards in section 72, in which he says, when I have provided the proofs of these sources, I shall then reveal those, even of the Greek writers, who have made reference to the Judeans, so that our detractors may no longer have even this pretext for the case they mount against us. So Josephus here is going to be adducing proofs from those most trusted histories that we talked about that the Jewish race did indeed exist. And the word translated proof is pistuo, once again, faith, believe. So Josephus uses pistuo in the sense of something being credible or confirmed by data. And again, pistuo concerns confidence, not the assent of faith. The next instance we find of pistuo is rather late in the work, Against Apion 1:112. And he says, I shall present as my witness Dios, a man trusted for his accuracy in Phoenician history. And here we have, again, the word pistuo being used. So Dios is trusted or believed. Now notice, he's trusted or believed not because Dios was a prophet, right? He's a Phoenician writing history. So there's no notion of divine authority in this use of pistuo, but because of the quality of his work, that makes his work trustworthy or worthy of belief, is because of the accuracy in Phoenician history. So we see similar results, by the way, when we look at the opposite of pistuo, which is apistuo, or disbelief. He uses this term a few times. For example, at the very, very beginning of Against Apion, in Book 1, Section 2. He says, some out of malice and disbelief of what we have written on ancient history. So he's talking about his Greek detractors, that they discount, they do not believe what he wrote in Antiquities of the Jews. So those who rejected Antiquities disbelieve his historical claims. They didn't reject his writing because they lacked inspiration or they refused to give religious assent to Antiquities. That is entirely foreign to the context. Second instance touches on Josephus's purpose for writing Against Apion. He says in 1:6, quote, pay attention that they pay attention only to Greeks on matters of great antiquity, expecting to learn the truth from them while disbelieving us and the rest of humanity, unquote. So his Greek detractors, they trust only the Greeks in matters of great antiquity, and they distrust Pistuo, us, that's Josephus, and the rest of humanity. Now, obviously, this distrust, or not having faith in, you don't see the notion of divine sense of faith in the writings, obviously, because like we said before, they didn't reject Antiquities because they didn't believe it was divine. They rejected it because they didn't believe the Jews existed and it wasn't proof. All right, next instance comes late in Against Apion, and this is in 1 and section 161. However, it is necessary to satisfy also the inquiry of those who disbelieve the records among the barbarians, but see fit to believe only the Greeks. So he's almost repeating what we saw in the last example. Now notice he uses Pistuo and Pistuo together in tandem. So this is a unique passage for understanding how he understands Pistuo in the context of Against Apion. What does this survey tell us about Pistuo and how he uses it in the context of Against Apion? Well, trust or belief is a key term in his argumentation. It's used to vindicate Antiquities by showing that it is to be trusted or most credible. So when he uses it in 138 in regards to the 22 books, he's not using it in the sense that these books are books that we believe in, like they're sacred books, that they have God as the author. Now, let me make this clear. I'm sure he does believe that. There's no doubt because they're written by prophets. So he does believe that. But the word trust or believe, Pistuo, in that context, however, is talking about something a bit different. He's talking about confidence. He's talking about the ability to conform to data, the accuracy of historical records. Okay, and this is seen even by Steve Mason, a Josephine expert, who says, quote, he, that's Josephus, is not reflecting the Judean community's unique language of faith or some such thing, but only providing a contrast to his earlier notice that the Greeks are loath to trust even their oldest works. And he points to 114 and 161 that we saw in our survey. So even Mason, who is one of the top Josephine experts out there, admits that the word Pistuo in the context of the 22 isn't talking about their unique language of faith, quote unquote, but rather he's using it in contrast to the disbelief in the credibility of these historic sources. So Josephus is concerned about the reliability of the books, not their inspiration per se. Inspiration does play a role in Josephus, but it's a very minor role, and it's subordinate to the main purpose of his work, which is to show that the earliest histories of the Jews are credible histories. So we'll just park it there. And then next time when we come back, we will take another look at another key element in which the canonical interpretation rests. So if you like this video, you like the videos on this channel, if you could, please hit the thumbs up, leave some comments, appreciate it. Until next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.